Okay. Yes, my name is Bobby Watlington. I've been living in the neighborhood for close to 60 years. I am a reputable representative of the neighborhood in this current phase, but I question my past somehow. But then again, I'm not alone. But unfortunately, as I age, the people who are older are all dead. So I'm like, where do I belong? Where do I fit in? When I got down here, it was interesting because I was over on Avenue C and B, which to me was the East Village, because you had the black cultural movements and whatnot, and you had the whites that were bringing in their energy, and you had just the naive people that were there. My first apartment down here was down the block there. I shared it with two guys. The rent was $35 a month, which we couldn't make. But back then there were so many apartments, if you knew supers and people, you could just move right on in. So I lived with three characters. One guy was like dressed like a Rod Stewart or whatever, and then there was a guy who was a Woodstock guy, and then there was me. You know, and the funny thing is, and this is funny because girls were coming to the Fillmore over here, and they were living in Long Island, Great Neck, Connecticut, and they didn't want to go home. So they would have to come, they would be willing to come visit three strange guys. So it was a party. And we had drugs and all that bullshit, so that was another thing. Well, what happens is, eventually, drugs were no longer fun. This Fillmore East, you could see great acts for $5. You could stand online, and we were the kids who were saying, look, we got friends that work here, we'll move you up for, it was theater. It was really theater. Yeah. So that's why when people say, Bob, you're an artist, no, we like your art. The ultimate goal in my mind of an artist is to make themselves the art. Because this way, you're just being you.
Yep.
But I notice that people who become famous, who I've known through the years, their whole demeanor changes because they only exist as outside. Even if you look at, say, Picasso's work, his early work was fantastic, but the later work was calculated. And the art galleries, for example, they set up a pattern where they say, you have to do a series. My life is not a series. No. It's a bunch of little disjointed incidents.
Yes.
And emotion is what happens. I came to the East Village, and one of the things that impressed me most was this very place here, B&H. It was comprised, the work staff was comprised of old Europeans that would insult you, like old Jewish guys, but they didn't hate you. And you being a kid, you would sheepishly go in because you just got off and shot some drugs or did a scam or whatever. And here they come, here, look at them. And all these old guys are looking at you like, leave me alone. I just want a mushroom and barley soup with a little bit of challah in the side. And see, when they made challah back then, it was like cake. Today, yeah. But no, I'm not knocking this because everything changes, and of course quality changes, material changes. But what happens is, we used to come in here. I had a friend that was strung out on methadone, and he would sleep in his suit, but he would leave a big tip. So they would. so what happens is, Tony, his name was Tony, I love him, beautiful kid. I'm gonna tell you a little history if we walk a little further down the Gem Spa. Right here.
At the Gem Spa?
How's it going?
Good.
Okay, good.
Great. I love this city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This used to be a newsstand, Gem Spa. And they used to sell egg creams, and that was their big, for a quarter, now egg creams, I don't know how much they are, and comic books and whatever. They were all characters in here, but they were the characters you would read about in a play. Like this is where the basis of a lot of characters came from. Later on, you had the punk rock crowd. Well, the East Village was a ghost town too, which made it more creative. Because when there's a desire to have a lifestyle, people resort to their inner creativity as opposed to the prepaid creativity that we have now. When young people used to come here, they brought something to it. You know, they brought their idiosyncrasies and whatever, and from that you could amass a culture. There is no culture anymore. I mean, the kids, they want to be original without relying on the roots of culture. Because don't forget, the 1960s represented perhaps the most innovative movement in American culture, because prior to that we were all imitating our parents. This area, people were breaking loose. St. Mark's Place used to have the most creative stores. Now this looks like, I don't want to go into it because you might label me, but it looks like shit. What I'm saying is, we used to come here and a Peter Max mural would be up on the side of the wall. Peter Max was not yet famous yet. Then you had all kind of little craft shops, Indian clothing, but it wasn't what we have today, you know? If we move around the corner, I'll show you the best. Across the street from the Electric Circus was interesting because across the street from the Electric Circus was a place where there was the first head shop I ever encountered. And it was a great place. First time I heard Led Zeppelin was at that head shop. I wasn't into white music at all. I was strictly R&B, soul, doo-wop, shit like that. But what happens is, when I heard the guitars and I said, what is this shit? And my roommates, of course, they informed me. Then I heard Black Sabbath later on and all these groups, and I'm going like, there's something there. But you know what I found out? It's basically the essence of youth trying to break away from structure that has been established in the past. And I gotta say, sometimes I hear a song and I go, why do I know that? Because I'll take you to my favorite location.
¿Quieres un perrito?
This place here was the first head shop that was in the block. And at that time, I used to lean up against the fence, waiting for opportunities to come my way. Across the street used to be the Electric Circus, which was, Warhol was there once, and what do you call it? Jerry Brandt. Jerry Brandt was an icon. He came up with ingenious ideas about what the scene should be about. The last time Jerry Brandt, I've read a year or so, died, very little fanfare. He created something called the Erotic Circus, where they only stayed open 2 nights. It was in the building that Plato's Retreat was, and he was involved with everything. Well, the last time I saw him, my brother, Dennis Watlington, and his partner, Nina Rosenblum, were doing a film for Ted Turner on Sly and the Family Stone. And it was on TV and everything. Well, Jerry Brandt took us, this was a deserted, dilapidated building. It was being used for rehabilitation of, people who are on alcohol or drugs or whatever. Well, the structure was, I don't like it now, but it was an interesting structure. And we sat there And Jerry Brandt told me stories, well, he told the camera stories really, about Hendrix, the Stones, coming up late at night and jamming. And I was saying, oh shit, this would be incredible. I mean, I wanted to see it. So what happens is my brother and Nina, they later went out and interviewed Sly's parents and all that, mother really. But the point is, this building should have a plaque up. Nothing. Oh, I left out one part.
Yeah.
Downstairs used to be the Dom, which were the black hustlers, hipsters were going. So upstairs you had the white kids going, and downstairs you had the black intelligent.
Okay, but in the advertisements, they advertised Andy Warhol's things at the Dom.
Yeah, he was the original, yeah. Well, what happens is Andy Warhol's crowd moved over to Max's Kansas City, which was more, well, see, by the way, Mickey didn't really care for them that much, but they generated, you know, a revenue, a clientele, you know. So, but back here, you would see black kids pulling up in Cadillacs and white kids going upstairs looking for goofballs, you know, and at that time, goofballs were 4 for $1. So these were kids from Long Island and all these other
So what
places.
was a goofball?
A barbiturate, or you know, something. The girls loved it. See, this was during the period of women's lib, where women were breaking the chains, but a lot of them were using drugs to justify it. You know what was funny? 1972, this was a ghost town. I'm standing with a bunch of people, and this kid, blonde-haired, looks like he came from California, and he comes up and says, "Hey man, do you know where I can crash at?" And we all looked at each other. In the old days, we would have said, "Yeah, go over on 2nd Avenue, there's a loft, blah, 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 blah." All of a sudden we said, "Crash." You know, and that's when I knew it was dead. And that's when I knew I had to get rid of drugs in my life, because I realized it was a communal thing. You could come out here 3 and 4 in the morning. If it wasn't the dope fiends, it was the speed freaks. You might even get a girl on the way in, or on the way out.
So what were the years that this was, St. Mark's was actually a scene? Was it over by the Summer of Love?
Not really.
No.
See, when they talk about the stat, they're talking about Tompkins Square Park, which was sort of racist in many ways because it didn't include the Puerto Rican kids in the city. See, there's a whole isolation thing that goes on where the Puerto Rican kids would they would come around and they want to see and be involved in shit, but they were, no. Even in the 80s, they would open galleries, and until the Fun Gallery came about, the Puerto Rican kids were exploited. You know, they're breakdancing, spinning on their heads and all that. That was considered a novelty, but that was the only thing that made the 80s an international scene, was these kids, street urchins basically, to glamorize it a little bit less. The fact is that they would come down, and I could name names, but now they're big shots, so you know, they would come down, and this was their first exposure to white lifestyles. And a lot of them were victims because they began to believe the hype and whatnot. Club 57 was able to exploit them. Negril, all these places were able to exploit them. How's this going, Owen?
Beautifully. So, on St. Mark's, aside from the Electric Circus and the head shop, you had, I mean, you did give me an idea. They had,
oh, well, there was the bookstore that used to stay open all night, which later became the St. Mark's bookstore.
but not on this, but further up.
Right down, a few doors down.
Okay, so so tell me,
Okay,
introduce it again.
as I was getting more and more into the scene, I would go into this bookstore, the East Side Bookstore is what it was called, I believe, and it would be open 24, almost all night, you know, and the thing is that all kind of things went on in there, you know, because a lot of the junkies would bring in, you know, cameras. The video camera was relatively new, So these guys would steal anything. I'm not a thief, I don't have the courage, but they would steal anything. And you know what, why I bring this up is that I was speaking to Bob Constant the other day. He's the owner of the bookstore when it moved over here. But over there, it was sort of a ragtag hippie dip thing kind of thing. But they would have little brochures from all over the country. You know, like little pamphlets, poetry pamphlets. People all wanted to say something. And I would copy down the names and address and enclose my self-addressed stamped envelope with poems and stuff like that. And sometimes you get a response back and it made you feel good. So from that moment on, I began to spend more time in bookstores. Back in my youth, I spent time in bookstores on 125th Street, but it was primarily to get comic books. Because I was a big comic book freak. I had everything. First Spider-Man, first this, that, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I noticed that obsession is not you can replace obsessions with from comic books to drugs to sex to rock. You know, it's a sickness because of the ability to create endorphins can come from anything. You know what I mean? I used to gamble with guys. I don't know nothing about gambling, but they were all cheaters. But I wanted to see if I could gamble around their cheating. So I would lose money, but I was bored, you know. And so I have to. Luckily, I put art in the place of and music and dance and all that. I found myself living my fantasies. You know, when there's a saying, my fantasies can become my reality. I thought you only could do it under drugs. No. Once you have the seed, letting go, and this might be some kind of sensory type of thing, you know the feeling of contentment. When I go to the museum, and my favorite museum is the Met. When I go there, I don't examine the details. I want to see what I feel when I see it, so that when I go home and I do my own stuff, if I feel like, hey, I'm in the right arena, you know what I mean? I started painting about 40 years ago. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an illustrator. I had a kid in his 3rd grade named Richie Del Vecchio, Italian kid. See, back in those days, Italians, Puerto Ricans, and blacks were considered the 3 dumbest groups in New York City by the Board of Education. No, they were bored with sitting there. That was a problem. Richie Del Vecchio, he became my idol because he could draw Pegasus. And I was blown. Now, you got to remember, this horse was so beautiful in my mind. And I used to wait for him to come to school. He would never come to school, though, because I wanted him to draw more, you know, of the characters from, you know, certain periods and whatnot. I want you to get this here. Look at this, right here. I had to think about that when I first saw it. Well, you're at the infamous St. Mark's on the Bowery Church. That was the home for a lot of the literary, quote-unquote, geniuses who came out of the Lower East Side or the East Village. And as we know, a lot of the artists that we praise and respect were malcontents and misfits, and some of them had just a certain amount of genius. I mean, it was very isolated. Again, when we talked before about race, the black artists like Baraka were acknowledged, but those that were marginally known were ignored.
Who were some of your favorite poets that have read here?
I like the bums that lived through the 50s and 60s.
The bums?
Yeah.
Such as?
Well, let me think.
I don't know, like Corso and...
yeah, well, because they were entertaining. They didn't know what they were doing half.
Giorno.
Yeah, they didn't know what they were doing half. Well, Giorno was a different case. He lucked up and had connections and whatnot. But some of them were just survivors. And you know what was funny? If you look at the whole so-called hip scene in downtown, a lot of kids were on stage, even when they weren't on stage. Because a lot of rich kids came down, and they would be at Max's, and they would do all kinds of crazy shit to impress people like Warhol and all, you know. And I remember my encounters with Warhol was, I could see through it, and he was threatened by that. Because, you know, they were, you know, they were good guys, a lot of the people, you know, the artists, they're mainly gay, but they were great guys, they were creative. They had, I don't find that with the gay community anymore. You know, that thing that made you want to be there. Nowadays, they're just like everybody else. Now, you might say that's good for a kid in Des Moines, but in New York, being outside is such a luxury if you can look at it constructively. Being an outsider means you don't have to adhere to a certain dictate or a rigidity. Being outside allows you to make mistakes and not be judged for it. Because what I find in painting, I'm an abstract expressionist, when some of the best paintings are mistakes. But seriously, I also feel that my involvement in the community used to mean something, but there is no community any longer. There's no artist community. The East Village had some of the biggest egos in the world back in the 80s. And I mean, there were guys that were fantastic. There was a club called the Pyramid Club. It was it was multicultural in the sense of sexuality, but some of the best talent was there. And it was for fun. As soon as they were getting write-ups in the New York Times and being acknowledged by the Museum of Modern Art, et cetera, it wasn't fun no more. So a lot of the great people, there was one guy named John Sex that would put on a show that was like a Las Vegas fucking show. I mean, he had a look, he had everything. I was like, God, we're in this little dumpy club, the Pyramid, and he's really giving us, on Club 57, he's giving us it. You know, he's got it. And then what happened? Of course, the virus came in and wiped him and a lot of the creative minds out. And now we're stuck with all the imitators.
So besides John Sex, who were some of the other characters at Club 57 or Pyramid?
Oh, what was that? Oh, God. Well, there was, of course, the B-52, what's the one from Atlanta?
Yeah, B-52.
B-52s. Why I liked them was because they knew music. They were country boys. They knew how to rock a fucking joint. You know what I'm saying? And Lou Paula would come in through there sometimes. But it was great because you see Rastas, you see punk rockers, you see perverts, straight men that were there perving on. But it was an energy in that little room that you couldn't duplicate anymore and whatnot. And Club 57 was the same way too. Ann Magnusson, I think she was a gem because she, unlike so many of them, were open to other phases. So you have to remember the Mud Club was a reaction to 54. And it's funny because they claimed that disco was whatever, but it was basically a disco. It was, with creativity. No, I'm not knocking it, and they also had a door policy. So, because you know, a lot of the people from down here couldn't get into places like 54, because basically the people at 54 were squares.
Describe the Bowery before the Bowery Bar.
The Bowery was a hellhole. I mean, see, you had to be an adventurous suburban kid to get off on walking in through all that shit. Meaning, like, there were dangerous people on the Bowery. My first experience with the Bowery was I ran away from home in the 60s. And at that time, it was mainly white Irish guys that were there. And they were winos. Then later on, the hippie movement brought in people that were getting cheap lofts and whatnot. But it was scuzzy. There was one garage, they used to have garages there. You know, they've gotten rid of all those things, but there used to be a garage where they'd have junkyard dogs that would come out, and these dogs looked mean. And this wasn't too far from CB's. But most kids came to New York from other places to adventure that fear factor. Well, I liked Hilly, because Hilly's joint was supposed to be country, blues, etc., etc. But they made money off of the new kids who were claiming it, like most young people do. They say, we're here, we're going to establish our thing. And it was kind of romantic and glamorous for them to live in squalor. Now, not to say the rest of these villages, but at least it was a step above that. And it was funny because when I ran away from home, there was these guys stretched out in the street, and it was scary. I was young, I was about 14 or 15. I stayed away for one night and came home, knocked on the door, but that was another thing. And then, of course, there was the dolls. Now, to me, David Johansen is a mensch. You always knew he knew more than what his facade presented. He later became, as you know, Buster Poindexter, the whole thing, whatever. And he was a great guy. And then there was Arthur Kane, who was another doll, who was always high. He had a girlfriend named Connie. They used to fight all the time on St. Mark's. St. Mark's was a ghost town, but it had the best characters. And if you wanted to see them stretched out on the street from too many whatever they were doing, it was interesting. But see, pain sometimes and tragedy breeds a certain amount of angst that leads to creativity and whatnot. And then who else? Oh, there was Frenchie. And Frenchie was the manager of the dolls at one time. And Syl Sylvain. Yeah, he was the quiet one. He probably was very bright, because he wasn't like ostentatious or whatever. But there were times that they used to come to Max's, and Mickey wouldn't let them in because they didn't have any money. Within a year or two, they became the hottest things in the fucking club. See, Mickey got rid of the club, and Tommy, some guy named Tommy, I forgot his name, he took over. He looked very straight, very square, but he gave the new wave of punk scene a whole bunch. And Max has always had good blues. And see, Mickey was an old school guy. I remember I went one in there with an Indian outfit during the daytime, and these guys, they might have been cops, and they started calling me a fag and everything. I said, "What? You don't even know me. What are you talking about?" "Well, you got on Indian pants and Indian shirt." You got to remember, most of New York was relegated to very traditional square ways. The West Village, for example, the same Italian kids that used to beat up lesbians and gays, in 3 years, they go to California, come back, they got paisley print, and I says, this is such bullshit. Oh, James Baldwin writes about living on Bleecker Street in the 40s, I believe, how he, a little ugly little gay black man, had to run home and run to work because gays were not accepted. That's why I like the East Side. East Side was more tolerant. Everyone talks about the West Village was foolish. You had too many fucking irate Catholics who were not practicing, but they become super Catholics all of a sudden. Here we had Jews. They were intellectual. They let us have a life. It wasn't necessarily I'm very serious. They were really horrible. The West Village was horrible. No one talks about it, but in '77, I believe it was, there was a race war in Washington Square Park. The Village Voice covered it. And innocent blacks were beaten up because 2 Italian kids get beat for weed. They bought bad weed. And the police condoned this shit. Because, I mean, this was the way the West Side was. The East Village was not always a picnic, but they were more tolerant. And I will always treasure this neighborhood because if you didn't get involved with other people's scene, you could do your fucking thing. Wow. One of my big adventures was seeing a group called the Motherfuckers. The Motherfuckers used to be on Bill Graham's ass to give a free night to the neighborhood kids. I walked in there, the Joshua Light show was going on. There were nude women. I had never seen this before. I was in heaven. I was saying, they're naked. What the hell is this? Because in black neighborhoods, that's a no-no. You know, I don't know about today, but back in the day, you know, you had to be a bit more refined. When you went to church, you wore a suit and a tie, and the church people go to flip-flops and all that downtown. But no, but seriously, I saw the Joshua Lights show, and it was amazing. It was fucking, and these guys weren't famous yet. You know, his light shows later became a tool for many later projects and what. And I just fell in love with the neighborhood. I just fell in love with it. Harlem, which was full of experience at one point, became so one-dimensional, where whole blocks were selling drugs, grandmothers were selling, and this was all part of the system. And then the black nationalists would say, they'll never take this neighborhood. Hey, Bill Clinton moved up there and just took the fucking thing, you know. And I was always, my heart was in Harlem, but my soul was down here, because this is where I grew up. Back in the early 60s, 64, 63, I used to go up to the clubs in Harlem and sit outside. I was too young to go in, and watch the old ladies in their red dress going to see Jimmy Reed, B.B. King. And I would come home like 12 o'clock, and my mother would say, I told you had to be in the house at 10 o'clock. So my rules are not good, so go back to where you were. So I would sleep in the hallway, and at that time the hallway was clean, no graffiti. I know everyone thinks graffiti's art, but it should be relegated to the field of art, because it's really disgusting, because it takes and it demoralizes people who have aspiration to see, you know, whole walls, and it's usually a cry for help or recognition. And it's
graffiti is beautiful.
I didn't say that, but again,
no, I know you didn't.
Sex is beautiful too, but you don't want to see it in the middle of the street.
Oh no, it's art in various places, but oftentimes it's just random and.
Yeah, well, like I said, if it's done responsibly, and some of it is mind-blowing, but it kind of deteriorates the mindset of people who just want to be. And I know that it's an age-relevant thing, but if I don't want it in my building. You understand? But if you go on the Lower East Side or East Harlem, it was placed everywhere inside. And usually that gave the landlord the criteria to say, these people don't care where they live at. It's in the hallway, even worse things in the hallway. The thing is that you want, as a child, you want to feel you're a part of a system and a society. You don't want to feel that you're relegated to being a street urchin, basically.
Herbert Huncke, were you friends with her?
No, see, I'm a coward. Those guys were crazy. They were looking for excitement. I just wanted to be high, get some pussy, and read a book or do something. I was like, and I even told Penny that. I said, look, Penny, I knew all those, I knew all those characters, but I was just, I hate to say it, that wasn't where I wanted to be. I wanted to be in the heart of stuff without being a part of it. And being a junkie down here back then was rare, because they was all speed freaks. And that was horrible to me, because I would use it when I couldn't get drunk, and I would become catatonic. I couldn't talk, and that's weird. I couldn't talk.
Where did you meet David Sands? Who is David Sands?
Oh, David Sands is a guy who I've seen for probably close to 35, 40 years. We always used to meet in Washington Square Park to listen to music. And he always looked so elite and aloof to me, because everyone in the village was like always, out there, doing that, trying to be noticed. He was just this guy, he was always clean cut. He'd always have a nice shirt on, like starched or whatever. And then we're sitting on a bench one day and someone mentions Bill Heine. Now, Bill Heine sort of was a guy who I had met up at a poetry therapy psych group. And this was an interesting group because in order to get drugs, you had to write poems. So the guy that was the leader of it was the head doctor of a major hospital, psychiatric clinic in Cumberland. And I love the guy. He never said nothing. We always were under the impression that the psychiatrist would say something. He just sat there and watched. And we were the entertainment for him. Those of us that experienced the 60s, I'm gonna tell the truth. The other people, we sort of looked at askance because Bosky had offered me paintings and I wouldn't take them. I said, who the fuck are you? I see you in Washington Square. What do I need? You know, not because I thought it was better, but because it wasn't my scene. I was just there. My scene was the 60s because there was a certain cohesiveness in the 60s that was lacking in the 80s. See, nobody cared about fame in my crowd in the 60s. It was all new. Accidents were genius by some strange circumstance. You know, like sometimes you don't want to go somewhere and you find out you had the greatest time in your life. Nowadays, when you want to go somewhere, you already got a map out in your mind what it's going to be like, who you're going to see. The 80s represented that. I knew that when I went to a certain place, and trust me, I had a great time doing this, but it was predictable. You knew who the snooty ones were, you knew who the writers were, you knew who the insecure ones, and
In the 80s.
yeah.
All right, so 1972, though, when you straightened up between 72 and 80, what the hell was happening?
Clubs, underground clubs.
And so the scene was not like that, though. It was more authentic.
It was more real, more misfits.
Gotcha.
And the thing is, misfits who had done something or were known for, you know, being creative, but not rich. See, when wealth entered into the picture, what generally happened was it perverted everything. Some of the artists that were great artists now had to work for a gallery and put out what the gallery told them to put out. The late 70s was really when things sort of hit. From 77, 76. But prior to that, everything was sort of clannish. When clubs opened, disco saved the Lower East Side.
And so, what, in this late 70s, what was one or two of the places that characterized?
The Mud Club, Studio 54, mainly Studio 54. That was, and see, what also the exclusivity thing came in, where it was sad because there were Rolls Royces, there were all these fancy people that never did anything in the 60s.
So they let you into
Yeah.
Studio 54?
How I got in, I read about it in Earl Wilson's column. And my brother was a film writer, and I got his company to write a letter for me. I found 3 Asian filmmakers, and I walked around the back door, and I said, Bobby, you've got to get there early, because, you know, most people are fashionably late. I get there early, Steve is at the door, and Steve said, I said, excuse me, and he's this little guy, and I'm like, he says, well, who are you? I says, my film crew wants to shoot this, so, oh, come on in. Don't forget, that's Brooklyn. See, the psychological thing about being in Manhattan was what got me over. But then I had such a great time, and I met people and whatnot. So they were inviting me back because I wanted to be. What's up? All right. I wanted to be distant, but they didn't know that. See, they read books about blacks, which are misleading. They thought that every black, they didn't want the social scientists never recognized that black culture was always stronger than white culture because it was Jewish culture was always stronger than white culture when they were outsiders. You understand what I'm saying? Because when you're oppressed, you create your own little dynasty. When I got into the club, we didn't go on the main floor. Alvin Ailey's dancers were hired. Fiorucci was the clothing designer that they were wearing their outfit. We went up in the balcony and waited till opening time. And yeah, well then that led to New York, New York. That led to Regime. Regime was there before. All those places because attitude. And one thing about Europeans came to New York and started buying $500 bottle of wine and all that.
And you went to New York, and Regimes as well?
Just going there to hang out.
Gotcha.
Because again, write a letter, have it typed, and say, look, I belong there. You know? And the thing is that most of these doormen were from Queens and Brooklyn. They don't know who anybody is, you know? And it's all about attitude. It's not about anything else. I don't know what, everyone's hip nowadays, but back then, it was a handful of people that were really considered hip. Most people were pretty traditional. They would go home on the weekends and smoke weed. You know, they would do their thing, but there was very few people who would go out and brave the wilds of New York City streets, you know?
What about Harry Smith? How well did you know Harry?
Well, the funny thing about Harry Smith was I known him for years as a bum. I had no idea who he was. But I would help him out because he would be so fucking drunk and whatnot, and he was terrible. He would slobber over himself, whatever. And then there was a guy named Jamie Perpinon. There was a lot of guys that nobody talks about, but these guys were brilliant because speed made some people sound brilliant if they weren't brilliant.
So when do you think, was it in the late 80s that you knew Harry?
Late 70s.
Okay, so...
I think he was living in a flop house then, some single room occupancy. Then I heard he later moved to Chelsea. Yeah.
And I think...
But he's supposedly he's who?
Jerry Garcia.
Oh, I didn't know. Because I know that he was an inspiration to a lot of kids. What's his name? From Sonic Youth?
Thurston Moore.
I think I like him too. I like him a lot. He's a record guy. I'm a record guy.
Yeah.
He loves vinyl. We love vinyl. I'm sorry.
All right, you know what? I think that's...
Yeah, we're cool. Anyway, yeah. I don't know what I said, but I'm sure that there's something in there.
It's good. You got it. We talked about everything I wanted. I appreciate it.
So I want, when you make it up, finished product, let me get 2 copies. All right.